Morning, folks. Whoops. Probably couldn't hear me that first time. Morning, folks. Gonna go ahead and wait my customary minute or two for folks to come on in the room. Hope everyone is having just a lovely time staying home. I hope everybody is staying home. I know there's a bunch of people out there who are getting restless. But it is, of course, still crucial that we follow the recommendations of public health officials. So stay home, avoid human contact, all of that good stuff. And while you're doing that, I hope that you are having a good time staying sane and all that good stuff. Oh, wow. Why is my head so big? And why is it so choppy? Hold on, folks. What if I do that? Why is it so huge? I don't want to be that huge. There we go. No, don't exit. Yes, Kathy, this is the live lecture. Hi. Watching me fumble around with my controls wasn't enough of a giveaway. Anyway, okay. So let's see. We've got a few folks watching, and so I will go ahead and get started. Now that though my video is still really choppy, I don't know why. Anything I can do about that? You know what? I'm just going to have to deal with it for today. Anyway, today we're going to talk about Chapter 15, which is about the bureaucracy. The bureaucracy is sometimes called the fourth branch of our government. It is the part of the government that actually carries out, most of the tasks that we set out for the government. So unless it's, the presidency or the courts or the Congress itself, it's part of the bureaucracy, right? And so that means including folks who do everything from, inspect and certify airfields to make sure that your meats are safe, to build trails in the Adirondacks, to interdict drugs on the southern border. It is enormous piece of machinery, as it were, a huge institution which has far-reaching implications for every single one of our lives, and that's why we're talking about it today. In this chapter, we're going to talk about how it is that the bureaucracy developed, how it's meant to work, and why programs and processes sometimes don't always work exactly as they're supposed to. We're going to talk about how federal agencies do their job, specifically rulemaking, which is an important process. We're going to talk about the different kinds of agencies that comprise the federal public service. There are 3 or 4 different kinds of agencies that make up the federal bureaucracy. And we're going to talk about, who, if anyone, controls this massive beast of a system that we have built. Obviously, at the end, we'll talk about possible reforms, because usually calling somebody a bureaucrat is not usually a compliment. Though I myself am a bureaucrat, I work for the state government, right? So, what I do and everything that you experience at CSN is part of our state's bureaucracy. There are an enormous number of people in our federal bureaucracy. 2.6 million civilian workers that work for the federal government in one capacity or another. Tack on top of that another 4 million active duty members of the military. So the federal government is, in many cases, the largest employer, and that doesn't count the many people who, like myself, work for state and local governments, right? Bureaucrats ranging from your city code inspectors to your your waste management professionals, your sanitation engineers, right? And we can get into private contracting and things like that too, because that's even a whole nother thing on top of that, right? But your teachers, your police, your fire departments, right? Many of these people work for local and state governments, and so there are a good 25 million people who, in one way or another, are getting paid by the federal government, or by the government in general in the United States, for their work, right? And like I said, I count myself among them, right? As does pretty much any teacher out there, right? Even private schools are often very heavily subsidized. And while we're discussing who works for the American bureaucracy, we should talk about, what these people look like. The good news is that the bureaucracy is by far the most representative branch of our government. This is the branch of our government that looks the most like the country that it represents. So you can see most people across racial categories are well represented, if not slightly overrepresented, in the bureaucracy, with the exception of Latinos, who are not heavily represented down here. So there are still problems, but you can see that white Americans actually have fewer jobs in the bureaucracy than exist in the U.S. population at large. You can see that we do still see more men than women. Do still see people with disabilities underrepresented. But for the most part, the federal bureaucracy looks very much like the country that it represents. It's one of the few institutions of our government that does. Remember, we talked about how Congress looked absolutely nothing like the country that it represents. That it's getting better, but it's nowhere near quite there yet. We talked about how the presidency often does not represent the country that it leads. Right? We have 45 presidents, and 43 of them have been white. There's been one black guy and one orange guy. Obviously, 44 of our 45 presidents have been white Christian men, and one of them was a black Christian man. Right? So not a lot of diversity there. But in the bureaucracy has been a location for diverse hiring and representation of minorities for a very long time. Actually, historically, certain parts of the U.S. bureaucracy have been historically more open, have in many cases been one of the only places that minority folks could get a job. So there is a very strong historical association between the African American community and the U.S. Postal Service. For a long time in the segregated South, being a mail carrier working for the Postal Service was one of the best, most stable jobs that a black person could get. If you worked in the North, they had Detroit had their factories and things like that, and in many cases, those places were at least a little more open to people of color than in the segregated South. But in the South, if you could be a letter carrier, and the federal government had a rule against discriminating against folks, you could be a letter carrier, and that was a good, solid job, right? So the bureaucracy has been a force for representation amongst our government of people who are normally underrepresented. So we have an enormous federal bureaucracy. But it wasn't always like this, right? Our nation started from humble beginnings, as did our government, and the federal bureaucracy was once confined solely to, a few people working at the State Department and a post office, right? More importantly, how we have hired folks for that bureaucracy has changed enormously throughout time. For a very long time, our bureaucracy was run on what we call the spoils system, which is a system in which government jobs are given out as political favors. So, hey, you want to be postmaster of your little town and run the post office there? Best way you can go about doing that is giving money to the right political candidate, right? If you give money to your friend, and crucially, they win office, well, then they'll appoint you to be postmaster of, West wherever, when they get into office. So to the victor goes the spoils. The spoils system means that government jobs were given out at all levels, from the top to the bottom as political favors. Now, obviously, some positions in our bureaucracy are still given out as political favors. And some positions are given out for political reasons. The secretaries, the people at the very top, and we'll talk about the difference between political appointees and civil servants. But back in the day, really, no, every job was given out as a political favor. And that means that if your party lost, well, you were out of a job, right? It means the whole government transitioned all of its employees every, 2 to 6 years. This actually started becoming a serious problem. There were so many people looking for a job when I think it was William Henry Harrison was inaugurated. The new president came off of his inaugural address, which, by the way, was the coldest inaugural day in D.C. history, and he didn't wear a coat. So he died of pneumonia because of that. But on that day, when he came back to the White House to try and find a place to meet with his cabinet, he could not find a place to meet with his cabinet. Every room in the White House was full of people looking for jobs. People who were like, hey, I did this to help you get elected, and now I scratch your back, you scratch mine, give me a job, right? And so eventually, and this is a true story, the White House staff filled up a bunch of wash tubs full of whiskey and orange juice, placed them on the lawn to lure the job seekers out of the house so that the president could find a room to meet with his new cabinet. So American history is just absolutely wonderful and insane, and so very, very drunk. Oh my God, I cannot stress how drunk 19th century Americans were. But so this started becoming a real problem, right? The nation grows bigger, handing out political jobs to your friends and supporters starts becoming less and less tenable. And by the way, it's also a terrible way to run a government, right? Okay. So imagine you are at a job and there's that employee there who has the same last name as the guy on the side of the building, right? It's like, hey, this is my nephew Blake, and we're gonna help him out. And Blake doesn't do anything, right? Blake knows that the reason Blake has a job is because Daddy runs the company, not because Blake is a good worker, right? And there's the same thing with the spoils system. All these people know the reason they have a job is not because they're good, competent employees, but because they have, somebody owed them a political favor. And so you have to imagine this is not the most well-administered government. Then things finally came to a head. So this is a cartoon of the guy who shot James Garfield. So James Garfield was waiting at a train station in Baltimore. So first off, imagine that. The president just kind of waiting for a train. But the president was waiting for a train to go from Baltimore back to Washington, D.C. And this dude, um, Charles Guiteau, walked up to him in the train station and basically was like, look, hey, I was a big supporter of yours in the election and you owe me and I never got my job. So you need to give me a job or I'm going to shoot you. And Garfield said, I'm not giving out any appointments at the time. And so Charles Guiteau shot him. And he lingered on for about 3 months before he finally died. Because he actually probably would have been fine with modern medicine, but apparently they were digging around on the inside of his body with like unwashed fingers and unsterilized instruments, and he got sepsis and died from that. But he's one of a few U.S. presidents who have been assassinated in office, and he was assassinated by somebody who was looking for a job. So, shortly after that was 1882, shortly after that, the U.S. government kind of decided that, hey, maybe they didn't want to be accosted by armed men in train stations when they were trying to go about their business. So maybe, just maybe, they should move away from the spoil system and more towards a universalistic politics, a government run according to transparent rules, impartially applied. That maybe we should hire government employees based on who's going to do the job, not based on who greased whose wheels, right? So we saw in 1883 the first move towards a merit-based, centralized public service in the United States. The Pendleton Civil Service Act in 1883 created a test, the Civil Service Exam System. And if you wanted a job with the federal government, you would go to your local county seat on exam day, and you would sit down and you would take a test. And if you scored high on that test, they would hire you. In fact, that's still the way that getting into the Foreign Service works. They have a Foreign Service exam, and if you do really well in the Foreign Service exam, then they'll hire you as a low-level diplomat in the State Department. So, Pendleton Civil Service Act moves away from hiring, hey, our friends, buddies, and supporters, and towards hiring the smartest and most competent people around, right? That's 1883, the beginning of the development of the American bureaucracy. So many forces drove the United States towards a more efficient bureaucracy. And I don't think I have any good slides on that, so no, I don't. First one is war. Right, so if we look at no, that's not it. I want one that shows like World War II though. There we go. So this is the number of U.S. military active duty personnel overseas. It doesn't show me World War II, but it does show me Vietnam. It shows some of the drawdown from World War II. World War II was like 16 million. There was a ton of people in the army. But it takes a lot of bureaucracy to manage 1.2 million active duty personnel, right? It takes a lot of bureaucracy to, remember back then they still had the draft, so it takes a lot of bureaucracy to manage conscription. It takes a lot of bureaucracy to manage training armed forces, moving them to where they're supposed to be, equipping them, keeping them fed, keeping them housed. All of that requires an enormous amount of logistical capacity. And when the war ends, a lot of that logistical capacity kind of sticks around looking for something else to do. Right? So in the wake of World War II, for example, there was an organization that was organized under the Department of War called the Office of Strategic Services, which was kind of the spy organization, the black ops of the U.S. military for World War II. It eventually grew into, after World War II, it grew into the CIA. Right? So a bunch of this logistical stuff happens and coalesces and is developed around the war. And like 80% of it gets dismantled after the war, but that other 20% sticks around. After each war, that starts to grow on itself, right? So war definitely pushed the United States towards a more centralized, more efficient bureaucracy. Another one that we might not recognize as much today, but was an enormous part of the growth of the bureaucracy throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was the enforcement of morality. So we're going to talk about this gentleman, Anthony Comstock. Anthony Comstock was the head of the New York Society for the Suppression of Vice, and was there to basically uphold Victorian morality, right? He opposed obscenity and pornography, contraception, abortion, gambling, prostitution, and oddly enough, quack medicine. So we can agree on that last one, but the rest of it. So he spent an enormous amount of time as an activist trying to get pornography off of America's streets and, importantly, out of the U.S. mail. He also, by the way, opposed women's suffrage. Well, this guy was such a major player in politics that they not only passed a law to ban obscenity and pornography from the U.S. mail, a law which is, by the way, partially still in place, called the Comstock Act, named after Anthony Comstock, but they gave him a badge. They made him a special postal inspector, gave him a badge, and let him ride around on the mail trains rooting pornography out of the U.S. mail. I'm not kidding about this, right? So this is kind of a famous political cartoon of Anthony Comstock, who was notably quite rotund. And the caption of this cartoon is, "Your Honor, this woman here gave birth to a naked child." Right? Here's another cartoon of Anthony Comstock trying to get the dogs and cats to wear skirts, and putting jeans on the horses, getting into his bath fully clothed, burning in hell for all eternity, naked save for a goofy clown mask on his ass. You can't make this stuff up, right? So that's Anthony Comstock, right? He was a moralistic crusader, and he actually had a major impact on U.S. law and U.S. policy. And we still, by the way, do some of this, right? It is a violation of federal law to air obscene programming at any time. It is also a violation of federal law to broadcast indecent or profane programming during certain hours. The FCC defines indecent speech as blah, 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 blah. But the point is that we still enforce this stuff, right? I cannot go walk down the street topless. I will be arrested for that. The FCC still monitors our broadcasts and makes sure that nobody sees an errant nipple. In fact, it's like 20 years ago at this point, but there was a Super Bowl involving Janet Jackson and a wardrobe malfunction where her bare breast was exposed on television for all of like half a second. And ABC paid millions of dollars in fines for that. tens of millions of dollars in fines for that. So we still use our bureaucracy to enforce morality on people. Not as heavy-handedly as we used to, but we still do it. Another big one is economics, right? The Great Depression, right? A major turn in the development of the U.S. federal bureaucracy was the Great Depression, because at that point you saw FDR and the New Deal Democratic Coalition pushing for a more active federal government. A federal government that was more involved in people's lives and did more to protect them from the vicissitudes of the market. The Great Depression demanded government response. I mean, we're seeing this right now, that you need an efficient bureaucracy in order to administer widespread aid or subsidy or economic stimulus programs. One of the big reasons why we're not seeing $2,000 a month checks going out to everybody in America like they are in Canada and much of Europe is that we simply don't have an apparatus that can do that. There is no centralized United States welfare system where you can just pour money and checks come out. We've seen all of the ridiculous hurdles that we've had to go through to get the IRS to send this money to people, which they're not really designed to do. The IRS is designed to take money in, not send money out. And so it's an enormous deal, right? It is a big thing. Having to administer programs like the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Civilian Conservation Corps, major increases in general relief and huge increases in unionization. All of that took new federal agencies, more capacity of the federal government to go out there and help people. You can't do it unless you have the structures in place to do it, right? Another big reason on failing on that is because of our federal system, right? We don't have a single United States welfare system. We have 50 separate welfare systems, actually like 54, 55, because the territories have their own stuff. And so it's really hard to just send everybody a $1,200 check, because those systems they're state to state, and they're also starved of resources because they're only for poor people. And as we talked about way back in chapter 2, programs for poor people are poor programs. Other things that push the United States towards a more efficient bureaucracy. Geography. I don't know if you've all noticed lately, but America is big. We are one of the largest countries by landmass in the world. I think we're third behind Russia and Canada, but ahead of China. We might be fourth behind China, but we're in that kind of size class, right? The United States is a large country. If you ever had occasion to drive across it, you know this in your bones. One time my friend and I did Fremont, California to Brooklyn, New York in 59 hours. 4 of those were sleeping. And it was absolutely brutal. Also, there's way too much Nebraska. We have too much Nebraska. We don't need as much Nebraska as we have. We could get rid of half of the Nebraska that we have, and we would be okay. So big country. And notably, a country that was not always welcoming to visitors or to settlers, right? As the nation expanded westward, the first bureaucrats to arrive on the scene were often the U.S. Army, right? Often the American cavalry. You've ever played Cowboys and Indians, right? Usually the Cowboys win. But the Army started pushing out and started enforcing the policy of Indian removal, started enforcing the Trail of Tears on the Cherokee back in the 1830s. And that's horrible, but it requires a significant bureaucracy. Just actually something that is really common to a lot of genocides, that they do require a significant administrative capacity to it as well. And so after the army came the land surveyors and the county courthouses and the assay office and the gold fields and Homestead Act representatives and so on and so on and so on and so on and so on. As people expanded westward, government followed them. And at times, government had to get creative to bridge the vast distances involved in the western United States, especially before modern transportation technologies were developed. So, the Pony Express riders were bureaucrats, and the whole system was only in operation for a little over a year and a half before the Transcontinental Railway was connected. But people, government bureaucrats risk death riding across open country to bring people your mail. Also, it should be noted that the Pony Express was not a service for the little people. If you wanted to send a letter the full length of the Pony Express, it would have cost the equivalent of about $1,200 in today's money. So, very, very sensitive documents only. But geography really did push the development of bureaucracy. So did race and ethnicity. I already mentioned Native Americans as one major example of that, right? Setting up a system to corral, contain, and convert Native Americans, which was the official goal of U.S. policy for a very long time, took a lot of administrative capacity, right? We have a federal Bureau of Indian Affairs still to this day for that reason. And then, when it was developed, it's designed to try and integrate Native Americans into, white American society, basically, right? And that included things that we've already talked about in this class, like the residential schools and, divesting the tribes of collective ownership of their land, and so on and so forth. Forced conversion to Christianity at sword point. But all that required administrative capacity, right? All that required, quartermasters and logistics and all that good stuff, right? Similarly, bureaucracy has been used as a weapon on both sides. I should mention, by the way, that today the Bureau of Indian Affairs spends a lot of time trying to remedy the systemic poverty and unemployment that exists out on these Native American reservations. It tries to provide basic services that don't get provided by basically anybody else. So that still is a demand of the community on the bureaucracy. Other ways in which race and ethnicity have led to the development of American bureaucracy, segregation had an administrative apparatus around it. I actually read a really fascinating article, I think it was in Salon, about the registrar of births in Virginia, and how basically he had this cockamamie idea that anyone who was Native American was at least part African American, and so therefore no births in Virginia were registered as Native American for like 40 years. If you were a Native American child, you were marked off as colored, and you were subject to all of those discrimination and segregation regulations that came with Jim Crow, right? Bureaucracy is also used to try and assist racial minorities, right? From the Freedmen's Bureau in the wake of the Civil War, had promised but never quite delivered 40 acres and a mule to every freed slave, to the U.S. Army being used to enforce desegregation orders at Little Rock Central High School, right? All of these are ways in which the bureaucracy has had to get more efficient to deal with the demands laid upon it by racial and ethnic conflict. So, the bureaucratic model. So there's this sociologist by the name of Max Weber, that's spelled Weber, like the grill. But it's pronounced Weber because it is German. I used to say, because I had a good friend of mine who had sociology, so I used to say, if you ever show up in Professor Yavorski's class, pronounce it Weber just to piss him off. And if he asks you why, tell him Allie told you. I don't think he'll be back at CSN by the time, hopefully, most of you have graduated. But yeah, if you do end up in Professor Yavorski's sociology class, pronounce it Weber and tell him Allie told you to. Anyway, so Max Weber came up with this model of bureaucracy. What is a bureaucracy? Well, he says all bureaucracies have these 5 characteristics. First off, hierarchy, right? In every bureaucracy, everyone has a clear chain of command, right? You've got a boss above you, underlings below you, and everyone knows who reports to whom. So you can look over here on this chart of the Department of Energy. You can see, okay, well, here's a secretary, and here's the deputy secretary, and here's the undersecretary of this, and the undersecretary of that, and then they have these offices, and they have directors, and so on and so on and so on and so forth. This is just a very high-level organizational chart, and it's one of the simpler of the cabinet departments, I promise you. But that's hierarchy, right? And you can see this in very disparate institutions. Like in the military, obviously people have ranks, right? You know, you're a private, or you're a sergeant, you're a lieutenant, you're a captain, whatever. And each one of those ranks is above certain other ranks and below certain others. So, you know, if you're outranked, then you take then you take orders, and if you're the upper ranking officer, you give orders, right? That's hierarchy. But while it's not nearly as strict in our institution, you know, it should be noted that professors have ranks too. You know, we have, you know, visiting faculty or adjunct faculty, which is me, by the way. We have assistant professor, followed by associate professor, followed by full professor, followed by named chair. We have a hierarchy of, you know, department heads and deans and provosts and the university president and the regents and all that. So we have hierarchy in many disparate institutions, right? Next, we have division of labor, right? You don't want me teaching a class on diesel mechanics. I'm not very good at it. I actually do know my way around under the hood of a car. I can fix it if it breaks, if I have to. I don't like to. I once fixed my Honda Civic with a paper clip and electrical tape. I was pretty proud of that one. But I don't like to, right? So you don't want me teaching your auto repair class. You want me teaching political science because that is my area of expertise, right? So in bureaucracies, that is what we see. We see people specialize in particular tasks, and we see those tasks divided up amongst them, right? We have professors of political science, professors of sociology, professors of this and that and the other. We have, you know, financial aid counselors. We have academic counselors. We have, you know, all the way up to the president, down to the janitor, right? Everyone has their own job to do. Everyone has their own task. That's what division of labor looks like. And you can see, again, we look over at the Department of Energy, same deal, right? Well, this is the National Nuclear Security Administration, so guess what they do? Here's the Energy Administration, so that's mostly about like actual electrical power. Here's the Undersecretary of Science, so they do research, right? Everyone has their own job to do. Third, bureaucracies operate on fixed routines. It's really supposed to be like, you know, every form is treated the same, every person is treated the same, every process operates on a fixed set of rules, and if you follow the rules, it works, right? So have you ever been at the DMV and had a particularly complicated transaction and they have to go get the book? First off, that's a bad thing because it means that you're going to be at the DMV at least another half hour. But I remember I had this old lady who was trying to help me with a ham radio plate in California, and she just did not know how to do it. Took like but she walked over to the back counter and had a big giant binder, not like this, but like 3 times this size, like one of these things. Big giant 3-ring binder. And she flipped it open to the index, and she looked to the. So there are fixed routines, right? Everything that DMV does is in that binder. There are fixed routines. There's a right way to do everything. And the flip side of that is that as long as you follow those routines, you're supposed to be treated equally. Everybody has the same rules. Everybody has to fill out the same forms. If you show up to the DMV with proof of identity and citizenship and pass your driver's test and you get your driver's license, right? It doesn't matter, if you're Steve Sisolak's daughter or something, well, you still need to take the driver's test. I don't care who you are, right? Equal rules for everybody. It doesn't matter who you are, who your parents are, who you support politically, what your demographic characteristics are. Everyone's supposed to be treated the same, right? Obviously, no human institution ever quite lives up to that ideal, but at least that's the ideal. I feel like the air's so dry today. Finally, people in the bureaucracy are hired based on their technical qualifications. I'm not here at CSN because I'm bribed Carolyn Goodman or something like that. I'm not here at CSN because I supported anybody politically. I'm here at CSN because, I went to school for this. I spent a lot of time learning about politics, and I've got degrees, and that's why they hired me, right? And also I said I was willing to relocate to Las Vegas for adjunct wages, so that was definitely part of the decision. Nobody ever plans to end up in Las Vegas. You just kind of end up here. But so people are hired based on their technical qualifications, not because of connections or anything like that. 5 prongs of the bureaucratic model: hierarchy, division of labor, fixed routines, equal rules, technical qualifications. Now you may notice that nowhere in there did I say anything about government or public ownership or elections or anything like that. We find bureaucracies in basically every sphere of human endeavor. Turns out bureaucracy is just kind of one of the only ways to organize an organization upwards of, a couple thousand people, right? And a lot of us are part of large organizations, part of large structures that, in which we live our lives. So bureaucracies are found everywhere. They're found in government, of course, but they're also found with your cable company, with your health insurer, right? When you call into your health insurer, well, that person on the other end of the line is part of the hierarchy, and their task is to take your claim and talk to you on the phone, right? And they have other people whose task is to deny your claim and send it back, right? They have fixed routines. Fixed routines mostly involve saying, "I'm really sorry, I can't help you, I'm just doing my job." Equal rules for everybody, right? At least theoretically. And these people are all hired based on their technical qualifications. So bureaucracy happens everywhere, not just government. Bureaucracy is also a dirty word for a lot of people. And that's because of bureaucratic pathologies. Problems that develop in bureaucratic systems. And one of the most infuriating, and you have experienced this before in your life, I promise, is the pathology of rote, which is when bureaucratic systems, because they run on these fixed, defined rules, often can't break out of those rules for any reason whatsoever, even when the rules clearly do not apply to that situation. So your textbook gives the example of a young 8-year-old boy named Mikey Hicks. Mikey Hicks got stopped every single time he tried to fly on an airplane because his name was on the no-fly list. Turns out there was a white supremacist, domestic terrorist type guy by the name of Michael Hicks, and every time Mikey Hicks tried to fly, he got flagged and he got searched and all that good stuff. Obviously, the TSA was wasting its resources, thoroughly searching an 8-year-old boy. But that's what the manual says I gotta do. I'm just doing my job, right? And so you've experienced this before, right? You've had some sort of situation where it's like, look, I understand that you're supposed to need a pay stub for my job, but I'm self-employed and I can't give you a pay stub because that's not how my income works. Yeah, well, I'm sorry. Well, I need proof of income or I can't rent you this apartment. I'm sorry, that's just the rules. I'm just doing my job, right? So that's a rote, right? That's bureaucracies failing to adjust to circumstances that should override some of the things that they care about, right? That's one of the most frustrating bureaucratic pathologies. So we also have bureaucratic pathologies like imperialism, which is that, people who run bureaucracies, they like power, right? Bureaucracies like to centralize, or bureaucrats like to have power. You want to have more people under you, more of a budget, more ability to get things done, right? And that doesn't necessarily need to be anything nefarious, right? I'm sure, I'm sure Trump's EPA director sucks, but I'm sure that there are people at the EPA who would really, really love to have more power so that they can better protect the environment, right? But imperialism, therefore, is an important part of any bureaucracy, right? People want more power so that they can do more of what it is that they want to do. And that can become problematic because on the one hand, it just leads to bloat in the system, right? It leads to more people doing more things and cross purposes that maybe they don't need to be doing. But it can also lead to turf wars, where two bureaucracies are kind of vaguely given authority over the same area, and those bureaucracies fight, right? They don't trust each other. Each of them kind of tries to build up their capacity to deal with that particular policy area so that they can, outmaneuver the other one. It becomes a big thing, right? It becomes very expensive. It can also lead to a problem of a lack of coordination between agencies, which can lead to tragic consequences, as we saw on September 11th, 2001. The Twin Towers fell largely because the CIA didn't talk to the FBI. The CIA knew that these folks who were the hijackers down in Florida knew that these folks were, in the country to pull off some sort of terrorist attack. But they never told the FBI about it because, they didn't have a policy of coordinating. And so when the flight school ran their background checks with the FBI was like, oh yeah, everything's fine, go ahead, teach them to fly, don't worry that they don't seem to care too much about landing. And we got 9/11, right? So lack of coordination can be a pathology in bureaucracy. We can also see clientelism, and this is a fun part of this lecture. Clientelism, when one particular branch of or one particular industry that's regulated by a bureaucracy ends up getting power over that bureaucracy. We also call this regulatory capture, right? When an industry that is supposed to be regulated by an agency is really kind of regulating that agency. But clientelism doesn't necessarily have to be regulatory capture. It can be just systemic. So there was a problem with the Obamacare website, right? I want to remember healthcare.gov in 2014 when it first came out, and they literally had one human being, a total of one person, sign up for healthcare on the first day that website was launched. The damn thing just cracked under the pressure. And that's partially because the procurement rules around federal contracting at the time gave the contract not to the folks that the Obama administration thought would be best handled to develop it, but to the companies that were big enough to hire, the lawyers and the lobbyists who were able to successfully complete the application, because a lot of these federal contracting applications, they're huge documents, right? And if you screw up on the application, well, you don't get the job. So in many ways, the federal contracting system actually prefers people who have already been contractors before, because they know how the whole system works. They know how to work the application process and all that good stuff. So that's bureaucratic pathologies. Do you have any questions so far? I feel like I'm really cruising through this today. So what do bureaucracies do? Well, they do two things. 1, rulemaking. 2, implementation. Rulemaking is a process by which bureaucracies impose regulations upon us. And the reason for rulemaking is this. So we've talked before about how members of Congress are generalists, right? They don't tend to specialize. Well, they do specialize a little in their committees and things like that, but most members of Congress don't have science degrees, right? If they have an advanced degree, it's probably a law degree. And so we have bureaucracies to do that stuff for them. Congress will write a law and say, we would like a law with these general principles, but we're going to let the whatever agency is responsible for that fill in the details, right? We're going to write a law that saying that we think airline pilots should have more experience than they currently do, but we're going to let the FAA come up with what exactly that should look like, because we're not really sure what training an airline pilot should look like, right? So the FAA is the one with the people who actually have the expertise to figure out what that is. So Congress delegates some of its legislating authority to regulating agencies. And those regulating agencies thereby get to make rules that have the force of law. Let me show you what that looks like. This is the rulemaking process. Proceedings, ECFS. Perfect. So this is the FCC's electronic comment filing system. It is where you can go to comment on anything that the FCC has under its current jurisdiction, right? So if you have an interest in communication stuff, these are the upcoming rulemakings at the FCC. Well, some of them not so upcoming. This is from 2017. But you can see some of them are really new, like COVID-19 telehealth program, March 27th, right? So these rules all start as drafts within the agency, in that case within the FCC. Agency employees will sit together and draft proposed legislation, and they will send that legislation, once they've sent it around and edited it within themselves, they will send that out to the Office of Management and Budget. You may remember the Office of Management and Budget from last lecture. Remember that they have the power of central clearance, meaning that anything that happens in the federal executive branch has to go through OMB first. So if Mick Mulvaney, who's currently also kind of doubling as White House Chief of Staff, decides that the regulation is okay and kosher and doesn't conflict with whatever principles the Trump administration imagines it has, then that regulation will be approved by the OMB and published in the world's most boring newspaper? FederalRegister.gov, world's most boring newspaper. This is the daily journal of the United States government. So we can look at the current issue of the Federal Register, and we can see that there's proposed rules from the Agricultural Marking System, the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service, the Antitrust Division, the Centers for Disease Control. A lot of those. Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, Coast Guard, Commerce Department, Defense Department, Delaware River Basin Commission, and on. Federal Aviation Administration. Looks like they may be having some airworthiness issues with Gulfstream private jets. Notices, Federal Communications Commission, Federal blah, 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 on and on and on and on and on. And all of these all of these agencies are proposing some sort of regulation today. All of these notices are coming out today. Proposed notices come out in this Federal Register every single day, and you can see here is a proposed rule proposed just today by the Federal Communications Commission. So I can link to it. It's got the summary, documents, dates, addresses. This is all the legal information they have to give you to say, hey, we're doing this thing. Does anyone have any comments on that? Agencies have to, by law, provide for at least written comment. So OMB approves proposed regulations published in the Federal Register. Then we have public comments. Agencies at the very least have to do 30 days of written public comment before a new regulation goes through. And that's what I was showing you here. This is the electronic comment filing system. So if you wanted to comment on the COVID-19 telehealth program, you could do that. You can click here, Express Reply, and you fill out your names, your address, I don't know. There should be a telehealth, whatever, right? Put in your programs there. Or put in your comments there. Those comments have to be read by the agency. They don't have to be acted upon by the agency. They have to be read by the agency. The agency has to respond to every single comment. They don't, though, have to do anything about it. This is not a democratic process. So, for example, I give you proceeding 17-108, Restoring Internet Freedom. Strongly encourage you all to read more about net neutrality outside of class, but essentially the question is whether or not internet service providers should be allowed to prioritize or deprioritize, and most importantly, charge for certain websites to reach you, right? Should we have to buy our internet like cable packages or no? Like cable TV packages where it's like, oh, well, you get these channels but not these channels, and those are extra, right? So overwhelmingly, 98% of the comments, and there are, as you can see, 23 million comments, that's almost 10% of the US population. Those 23 million comments, 98% of them said, you need to make the internet a common carrier. You cannot allow ISPs to charge us extra for access to websites that are already on the internet. The FCC said, yeah, we're going to do that anyway, even though 98% of comments were in opposition. So it's not a democratic process, right? But after the public comment period, the agency will prepare its final rules and an impact analysis. So cost-benefit analysis, impact analyses, are one of those things that sound really simple and sound really useful and helpful, but the devil is, as always, in the details. So adding up the cost of a new regulation is usually pretty easy. Say, we're the Environmental Protection Agency, and we're going to put in a regulation that requires coal power plants to put a scrubber on every one of their smokestacks. Well, I can actually figure out the cost of this regulation to society pretty quickly. How many scrubbers are there? Or, how many smokestacks are there? How much do the scrubbers cost? Multiply, done. But the regulation is intended to improve air quality, which does things like reduce rates of asthma in children. What is the monetary value of a child spending a year of their life without asthma? What is the monetary value of 1,000 fewer lives lost a year? How do you put a number on that? Well, it's hard. It's impossible, really. But agencies do it anyway. Agencies have what they call the statistical value of human life, and that usually ranges somewhere between $3 and $10 million. The idea being that, well, if this regulation costs $3 million but saves one human life, well, then it'll be worth it, right? But obviously, those numbers range wildly. And if you are a conservative and you want your government to do less, then you set your statistical value of human life higher, right? This regulation is going to cost $5 million, but save one human life. Well, the human life's only worth $3 million. Don't do it, right? If you're a progressive and you want the government to do more, well, human life's worth $10 million. Obviously, you do it, right? So impact analysis can be very much a political and contested process. It sounds simple. It's not. After the final rule and the impact analysis come out, those go back to OMB to make sure that Mick Mulvaney can sign off in the 2 seconds that he's not babysitting Trump. OMB approves, and it goes back in, again, that super boring newspaper, the Federal Register, to go into effect 30 days later. Of course, this is America, so if somebody doesn't like it, they're going to sue, because this is America. And so an affected interest can sue, or they can go back to Congress, and Congress ultimately can override any agency regulation it likes. And if those foes of the regulation are successful, the whole process starts over again at step one, right? Lots and lots and lots of fun. Do you have any questions on rulemaking so far? Anything like that? Okay, let's see, 10:15. Yeah, we're going to finish this today. How is the bureaucracy organized? Well, there are a bunch of different types of agencies in our bureaucracy. And again, if anyone has any questions for me, do feel free to throw a question mark up in chat and I'll stop, slow down. I feel like I'm just kind of on a roll today. We have a variety of different kinds of federal agencies. The big ones are the cabinet departments. There are 15 of these, and they're huge, right? So I have an extension that turns pictures of Donald Trump into kittens, so there's kittens. But so these are the offices that are part of the Cabinet of the United States. Secretary of State, Treasury, Defense, the Attorney General, the Secretary of Interior, Agriculture, Commerce, Labor, Health and Human Services, Housing and Urban Development, Transportation, Education, Energy, Veterans Affairs, Homeland Security, and those are the 15 executive departments. They're all huge, right? The Secretary of State, the Department of State manages all of our embassies all over the world in 150 countries. They're the department that deals with our passports, deals with our treaty negotiations, issues travel warnings, all that good stuff, all within the Department of State. Obviously, the Department of Defense is massive. 4 million active duty troops, an enormous amount of money and material and personnel. But the Department of Agriculture. The Department of Agriculture is huge. The Department of Agriculture includes everything from meat inspectors to the Forest Service to food stamps. And that is true of basically all the cabinet departments, right? All of the cabinet departments have some sort of, have a broad area over which they oversee with a whole bunch of little different programs within them, right? The Department of Transportation is the FAA, the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration, the Department of Transportation, the Interstate Highway System, all of that good stuff is all within one of these big cabinet departments. So these things are huge, and that can be very, very hard to govern, right? Especially when, as we talked a little bit about this with the presidency, when the cabinet, when the department is full of people who are not actually politically appointed. Remember, back with the 1883 Pendleton Civil Service Act, we went to merit hiring in our civil service. We went away from the spoils system. So most people working in these departments, most of your meat inspectors and forest rangers and passport clerks are what we call civil servants. They're career employees. They get their jobs with the government just the same way that, y'all got your jobs with your current employers. Which, by the way, if you do .gov, thank you for correcting me, Google. If you do want to get a job with the federal government, this is where you look for that, right? And it's just like getting any other job. So most of those people started working at these agencies because they wanted to make a difference, right? If you're a forest ranger with the Forest Service, you probably didn't sign up in order to make things easier for like mining and logging and oil drilling, right? So when Trump comes in and he's like, hey, open up all this Forest Service land for oil drilling, you think people are at the very least kind of dragging their feet on that? So the way that this is supposed to work is that the president's supposed to appoint a cadre of managers, what we call political appointees, at the top of every political agency. And you can see, if we look at the Department of Energy, a lot of these people are listed in bold, right? The secretary, the deputy secretary, the undersecretary for nuclear security, the undersecretary for science, the undersecretary for energy. All of those positions are appointed by the president. Except this president, I think I've mentioned before, has said that he doesn't want to appoint all these bureaucrats to federal agencies, and he can start whittling down the size of the federal government by just simply leaving several hundred positions unfilled. What he doesn't realize is that means that the people who are there are either holdovers from the Obama administration or, more likely, career civil servants who are not necessarily in any way beholden to his political agenda. So they're not necessarily going to enact that agenda consistently, right? And further, people in the civil service know that the bosses change out pretty often, right? We have cabinet secretaries serve an average of about 3 years. So, if you're, again, that forest ranger at the Department of Agriculture, and you got into this thing to try and help people go have fun camping in the woods and to protect the land from evildoers, and now all these logging companies want to come in and clear cut your forest. Well, if your boss is leaving in 3 years, maybe you just kind of try and wait it out, right? I also mentioned the problem of cabinet secretaries starting out sympathetic to a president's ideology and ending up in a place where they're really not. I mentioned Rick Perry, who's our Secretary of Energy, who said he was going to abolish the Department of Energy, but then got into serving the Department of Energy and realized the Department of Energy does all of our nuclear security, all of our civilian nuclear security in the United States. And so Rick Perry kind of decided that maybe we needed to secure our nuclear reactors and not abolish the Department of Energy. Right? So presidents have often expressed frustration at this tendency of cabinet secretaries to go native, as it were, and start empathizing with the people of the agencies that they run rather than with the presidents who appointed them. We can talk a bit about the cabinet and diversity. And the good news is that politicians of both parties have historically appointed diverse cabinets. So, this is a picture of the first Obama cabinet in 2009. You can see there are both men and women. There are people from all sorts of backgrounds. There's still a good smattering of old rich white dudes, but, decently diverse set of faces. You expect that from Obama, but looking at W. Bush's cabinet. Where's his cabinet? Come on. Here's Bush's cabinet. Again, a decent smattering of old white dudes, but we also see our nation's first African-American woman Secretary of State, who's also the first African-American woman National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice. Right? See, Elaine Chao's been in the cabinet for ages. She was our Secretary of Labor in W, and now she's Secretary of Transportation. Don't ask me how that works. So we did see some reasonable amount of stops towards diversity even in W. Bush's cabinet. You may see where this is going. This is Trump's cabinet. Vice President doesn't have much control over, but white dude, 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 black dude, Asian lady, white dude, white lady, white dude, white dude. Right. So we do not see a very diverse cabinet from the Trump administration. We see literally two non-white secretaries. That's Ben Carson at Housing and Urban Development and Elaine Chao at Transportation. Remember, Elaine Chao is Mitch McConnell's wife. She was actually in the Obama cabinet as well. She's just been in there for ages. And Ben Carson is a neurosurgeon, and I guess they just figured, put the black guy at Housing and Urban Development. That makes no sense. I would believe Ben Carson at Health and Human Services. I wouldn't like it, but I'd understand it. But yeah, so not a super diverse cabinet in this administration. Even though historically administrations of both parties have picked relatively diverse groups as their advisors. So we have agencies outside the cabinet departments. Cabinet departments are the big ones. There's 15 of them. The inner cabinet, remember, the most important ones are State, Defense, Treasury, and Justice. Remember, Department of Justice is the only one not headed by a secretary. We have an Attorney General, not a Secretary of Justice. And we have other agencies. We have independent executive agencies, which are things like the CIA and NASA, which handle primarily implementation rather than rulemaking. We have independent regulatory commissions, which are listed over here on this slide. These are commissions that, as their name says, primarily exist to regulate some aspect of American commerce, from the Interstate Commerce Commission, which existed mostly to regulate railroads in 1887, the Federal Communications Commission in 1928, the Securities and Exchange Commission, which sprung up to regulate the stock market in 1935, right? All the way up through Liz Warren's baby, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which went into effect in 2011. She fought really hard for that. So independent regulatory commissions primarily do the rulemaking. We also have central service agencies. We have two of them. One of them is called the One of them is called the General Services Administration, or GSA. This is their website. And you'll notice that they do a lot of buying, selling, contracting, travel reimbursements, IT services, real estate, all that stuff. GSA is basically the facilities department for the entire federal government. They're the people who buy the office buildings, stock the toilet paper, keep the lights on. Rather than having a separate department in every agency doing that, the federal government was just like, you know what, we're just going to have one big agency do that for everybody. Similarly with the Office of Personnel Management. This is the Office of Personnel Management. They are the IT department, or excuse me, not the IT department. They are the HR department for the whole federal government. Right? So if you're a job seeker, they tell you where to go. These are the folks who will tell you about your health insurance, your life insurance, your dental, your vision, all that stuff if you are a federal government employee. So they are the HR department for the whole federal government. Again, thought that it was kind of silly to have every agency do that on their own, so they have one agency that does that all for the whole, I should say the whole civilian federal government, because the Defense Department does have its own whole set of agencies that handle this for the military. But for the civilian government, these two central service agencies carry out jobs for the whole government. Finally, we're going to talk about private contracting. There's been a major shift in government in recent decades towards privatization and having jobs that were formerly done by government employees have those jobs being done by private contractors instead. Usually this is done because private contractors can get the job done more cheaply. The idea is that if we make companies bid for it, well, they'll undercut each other and eventually save us that taxpayer money. It should be noted, though, that private contracting mostly saves their money in labor costs, and so that does have its own effects, right? And I know I've given this example before in class, but if you're a bus driver back in my old hometown of Riverside, California, you drive the city routes and not the contracted ones. If you drive the city routes, you are represented by the American Transportation Union. You make $20 to $22 an hour. Medical, dental, vision, guaranteed 40 hours a week, retirement, the whole 9 yards. Some of you sitting there going, man, I should be a bus driver. Las Vegas, though, not so good. Because in Las Vegas, our transit operations are all contracted out to two private companies, MV Transportation and Keolis. And bus drivers here make closer to $12, $13 an hour to start. No bennies, part-time, all that good stuff that you're used to at every other shitty job out there. And so contracting ends up costing less per mile to run a transit bus in Las Vegas than it does in Riverside, just because labor costs are a big part of the cost of public transportation. But those people also aren't spending that money back in the community, right? People are the bus drivers don't have a living wage, right? So that's often where contracting savings come from. And unfortunately, it's just depressed the wages of a lot of people who used to be, doing menial jobs, but for the federal government, and therefore making decent money and having good benefits. So who controls the federal bureaucracy? Well, is it the people? Well, we've seen that the people can have some influence, right? We've seen that there are comment filing systems and public comment periods and hearings and things like that, where the public can testify and can have some influence on bureaucratic operations. But we also know that that's not a democracy, right? 98% of the people can say, hey, please don't do this thing, and the FCC can still say, you know what, we're doing the thing. So it's not a democratic process. And also a lot of the stuff that the bureaucracy deals with, for a lot of people, they're just don't have the background knowledge or the capacity to really comment on it. Now, I can tell you that, let's see, I'm going to go pull up the FCC again. I can tell you that me personally, I'm a radio geek. I could talk about the unlicensed use of the 6 gigahertz band. Like, that's something I could comment on. But I'm going to bet that of the 90 or so people enrolled in my class, maybe 2 or 3 of you could file an intelligent comment on that particular filing. Most of the rest of you got no idea what a 6 gigahertz band even is, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. That's why we have a bureaucracy, so that you don't have to care. There's a piece of the government that takes care of that stuff. But if it's difficult for people to understand what the bureaucracy is doing, it's difficult for them to hold that bureaucracy accountable. So how about the president? Well, technically, everyone in the bureaucracy ultimately reports to the president. The bureaucracy is located in the executive branch, and so the president can do things like, change out the Secretary of State if he's mad at the Secretary of State, which he's already done once. Right? The president can fire bureaucrats, can replace, the coronavirus czar, as it were, in the middle of a pandemic, which is like, oh my God. But the president can do that. So the president has some limited control over the higher echelons of the bureaucracy, and also has the ability to issue executive orders, which do govern how the bureaucracy interacts with the world. But the president also has limited control over the bureaucracy because there are protections against civil servants getting just summarily fired. So if you're not one of the highest of the high-level managers in the bureaucracy, usually there's not that much the president can do for you. I mean, besides tweet about you and throw you to the wolves, which is definitely a thing that the president does, but for the most part, there's not that much that he can do, right? Congress has some tools that they can use to rein in the bureaucracy. So, for example, Congress is the ultimate power of the purse, right? So Congress is the ones who decide whether or not your agency gets any money in that federal budget. You piss off a member of Congress, maybe your budget gets cut, right? Congress can hold hearings, and remember, they have subpoena power, so they can actually force agency officials and things like that to come testify. Congress is ultimately the source of an agency's power through the authorization process. So when Congress says, hey, we'd like to set up an agency to regulate, telecommunications. Here's the FCC. We're giving it the power to handle this messy technical stuff that we don't understand. Congress can revoke that, right? They can pass a law that says, actually, the FCC can't regulate this anymore. And then the FCC doesn't have that power anymore. Indeed, Congress can even go so far as to completely reorganize or disband an agency if they're that pissed off. Ultimately, though, it's not on your slides anymore, bureaucrats have an enormous amount of discretion in terms of what it is that they do. I'm a bureaucrat, and for the most part, I get left alone to do my job. So there's a lot of discretion in how I run my class and how I deal with students who are, cheating or failing or whatever. How I grade. All those policies are left largely up to me. Same thing happens if you get pulled over by a traffic cop, right? Traffic cop can let you go or not. It's really up to them. So critiques of the bureaucracy. Well, it's costly. It is slow and bulky and cumbersome. And hey, we just don't trust it, right? And so if you look at cost is really not that big of a deal. So if you can see with this chart here, you can see that actually, while America's economy has grown, the level of spending on the government as a percent of that economy hasn't really changed that much. It's just our economy has grown, so we've needed more bureaucracy to regulate that economy. But, government is somewhere around about 2-3% of GDP in the United States, and it hasn't really changed all that much. Inertia, well, yeah, the bureaucracy is slow. It's very slow to move. That's the system of government that we have. We could have a more nimble bureaucracy, but we'd have to change our constitution, right? So how do we get around these critiques and these problems, right? Well, there was an attempt to open up the system. The 1966 Freedom of Information Act is a type of sunshine law. Did you remember that from the very beginning of the class? A sunshine law passed on the idea that sunshine is the best disinfectant, that if you let the public look at what their government is doing, then it will be much harder for that government to be corrupt. As far as the costs go, there was a reinventing government initiative back during the Clinton administration that tried to really step up the use of information technology and computers, and that has really saved quite a lot of money since then. We also see a push towards privatization, which does save taxpayer money, although, as I said, has its own caveats. Does anyone have any questions on the federal bureaucracy? Because that is all I've got. You can just sit here and stare at my ugly mug for like 15 minutes or 15 seconds while I wait for questions. Okay, hearing nothing, I'm going to go ahead and call it here then. Everybody, that was the Chapter 15 lecture. We'll have the Chapter 16 lecture right here on Thursday, and I think it'll probably be a one and done as well. Normally, I do a really fun Supreme Court activity, but probably not doing that this time. So I'm going to try and have another review quiz at some point during next week, but actually, wait a second. Nevada. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting Nevada. I shouldn't forget Nevada. Home means Nevada. So 15 today, 16 Thursday, Nevada 1 and 2 next week. And then we are all done with this whole shebang, folks. We are almost to the end. And then you don't have to keep tuning into these obnoxious videos every week. I hope you are all staying safe out there. I hope you are all observing social distancing guidelines. Keep your distance, cover your face, stay safe, stay home, and keep on keeping on, folks. Good luck and have a great rest of your week.